Thank you so much, Boris and Daniela, for inviting me and inviting me together with Chus, which is always a pleasure. And first I need to say that I'm not quite doing what I announced because of my disorganization with the hard drive. So I have not the video excerpts that I was initially trying to bring in today. Can you hear me all? Is it fine?
Yeah.
Great. So the video excerpts are reduced to still images, and I took out 2 of the artist references because of that as well. So I really just improvise myself through a series of images and what they currently make me think of with you tonight. And this first image that you see here on the screen is an image that I just came across. It doesn't have any credit or caption. It's just really an image that I happened to stumble upon while researching the history of navigation systems. I've been particularly through the collaboration with the architect and theorist Eyal Weizmann, very interested and somehow dealing with the history of cartography and the kind of transformations that cartography has undergone from sort of, a kind of stabilizing objectivist tool from the age of the discoverers, the so-called discoverers, as a kind of, an important, if not one of the most important kind of devices in the long history of colonialism. And the history of navigation systems was part of trying to understand what has happened to maps. How have maps become sort of environments today? So what exactly? How can we describe a kind of shift also in relation to the mode of representation and the kind of older model of an objectivist representation that once was a paradigm, let's say, particularly a 19th century paradigm. And navigation systems seem to be an interesting kind of, they represent somehow a shift from a monologic relationship that we have to maps and through maps to territories, to the world, to a kind of, proto-cybernetic, like a mode of so a one-day life cycle. I think it's coming to an end. Where maps start to become environmental, that means kind of in certain ways dialogic, right? And that's part of this experience of being in maps, of course. No? So in fact, something like the history of navigation systems is introducing us really well into this kind of transformation. And I will not rehearse this whole history now, but just to mention that actually the first time that a car has been equipped with a kind of device that while the car was driving was kind of doing a sort of real-life mapping of its position, very mechanical but quite sophisticated, was already in 1910, much earlier than we would think of a car to be ever equipped with something like that, right? Obviously, having or not having a navigation system in a car changes your perception of both the environment and of yourself in it, right? And then, for instance, you have when the first navigation systems were coming commercially on the market in the 80s, you have an interesting shift sort of from the very first generation to the second generation, which is exactly the mid-80s, I think 84 or 85, where the second generation navigation systems do no longer show your movement on a screen, but show the world moving around you. No? So like where you occupy always the center of the screen. No? Kind of an interesting inversion of a way to represent, to be in, to think of one's own positionality in a way. So this kind of, complex of tracing and tracking that we are part of today, and what movement means when it is being traced and tracked, and what that does to the relationship between figure and ground, and world and reality, or whatever distinction one wants to bring in here in terms of perhaps something that pertains to the realm of radical uncertainty versus the realm of the mapped out, and the stabilized, the coordinate system in which one operates. I think that has a huge impact on our perception and on our subject constitution. And this kind of points where things like that happen, like in the mid-80s with the navigation systems, these kind of tipping points of inversion that interest me a lot. This kind of, moving from who moves actually, and what does that mean in relationship to this distinction between stability and mobility, and a kind of stabilized, fixed system, and that which transforms and moves. So this is the second of these kind of objets trouvés from the internet, a kind of visualization of the most literal visualization of what one can call technological environmentality, of the kind of data universe, and the kind of infrastructure that does this tracking and tracing and operates these grids from the first image. Now, this is a bit small for you to see in detail, so I'll just explain what you see. It's also very simple, and also I use it only as a kind of thought picture by way of introduction, like the other images. This is in fact one of the panels of the Anthropocene Observatory exhibition that was part of the kind of final installment of the Anthropocene project last autumn at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, where one of the projects that we did in the context of this Anthropocene project was with a group of urbanists, planners, and theorists called Territorial Agency, and the photographer and filmmaker Armin Linke. And besides sort of interviews that are of a certain observational kind, that Armin Linke filmed, where we went to many institutions, where kind of the question, the relationship between science and politics is at stake today, particularly in relation to climate change and other environmental grand schemes. So we just try to find out how do these institutions, what kind of language do they find for the kind of intersection between science, data, infrastructure, and politics. Also here, I'm not going to go into detail now, just this was part of that last exhibition where, in a way, these two images stood for, on the one hand, on your right-hand side, you have a visualization as these visualizations are being done, of kind of trade networks and human infrastructure on the surface of the earth, cities, roads, etc. And in our kind of introductory panel here, this was credited as being a picture of the world system in a kind of Wallersteinian sense. Or human infrastructure would be another way. And of course, the blue marble picture, the famous NASA picture of 1972 on the left, being sort of simply a literate illustration of what then, after, in the wake of this picture, in fact, became sort of the Earth system. No? So you have world system and Earth system, more or less an old dichotomy of culture and nature, if you will. And then the subsequent panels in this exhibition kind of described through visual materials and episodes how the right one would work on the left one in order to with the effect of transforming it. No? So sort of as one way of this kind of Anthropocene narrative of entering into a geological era in which human impact on the Earth system has become so large that it is of geological scale. So you have to imagine this kind of like Earth system being affected by, transformed by world system. Now, the way this kind of relationship, or the changing relationship that is indicated in this juxtaposition, in this rather old-fashioned juxtaposition of the first picture here, the previous picture, the way we've been trying to narrate and enter into some of these questions as they, of a less abstract kind of God's eye view level, was through this distinction of figure and ground. So what you see here is an image, an installation image, installation shot from the exhibition Forensis, that a group of researchers, architects, artists, and others organized over 3 years at Goldsmiths University, and which Eyal Weizmann and myself then turned into an exhibition. What you see here is Adrian Lahoud's work on the 2009 climate conference in Copenhagen, famous for those who are interested in this for failing spectacularly. And Lahoud took a kind of episode that happened more or less at the media fringes of this conference, where a Sudanese diplomat who was the spokesperson for the 70-something poorest countries at this conference accused the industrialized and mostly Western powers, but not exclusively so, of what he called climate genocide. And he used this episode in order to understand, how ecological questions and violence and political violence relate today, and how difficult it is to address them with the existing legal language and even other kind of languages. No? So simply on a level that was also what was sort of significant for this Forensis exhibition, which is a play with forensics, but as a kind of return to the Greek meaning of the forum, and what it means to create a forum for issues to become public matter. So this image that you see here is actually a kind of animation of aerosols emissions from Europe that affect the sub-Sahara cycle of monsoons and desertification process, but also intertwined with Amazon forest, let's say, emissions. The difficulty here being, and that's what for a forensic investigation normally needs to be able to establish a very clear connection between the gun and the bullet hole, and kind of planetary scale environmental problems such as climate change is, or any of the sort of subsystems of this so-called Earth system presents, you deal with something that one has to call kind of distributed causalities, right? Like where this kind of clear linear connection between cause and effect, such as in the gun and the bullet hole, cannot be established easily. And I think that is, it's just an example, but it also stands somehow for some of the problems that this whole question of technological environmentality poses to us. Now, this is the back cover of a publication that was somehow very influential and has a certain cult status. You can recognize it normally in people's libraries because it doesn't quite fit into the normal shelf. Kind of crucial document of Californian counterculture that sort of prepared the ground on the one hand for, a broad notion of systems theory, ideas of cybernetics across, technological systems, nature, society, psychology, etc. And was very influential for the early environmental movement, but also for the kind of Silicon Valley cyber-utopianism. Thank you. I'm just showing this back cover, which is actually from the 72 edition, which was the most successful one in terms of edition. It had a 1.2 million print run back then and won the National Book Awards in the US, so it was extremely popular. And in fact, a publication that was consisting mostly in the format of a mail order catalog, in fact, trying to sort of establish new ideas of kind of use value, for creating a different world, kind of from the filter system for water in your own garden to the shovel to actually mostly books, books mostly from this kind of new wave of theory production that belongs to this kind of systems and communications theory branch when this kind of thinking reached the new ecologies. And I'm showing this back cover because of the mantra that's written above the blue marble here. This kind of satellite blue marble, that is not an actual photograph or a pre-NASA spaceflight, a pre-manned spaceflight. It's before the Apollo 8 Earthrise pictures. This is a document that we presented in this exhibition, The Whole Earth, California and the Disappearance of the Outside, that I organized together with Dietrich Dietrichson, also as part of this Anthropocene project, because somehow it was important for us to understand, what is this kind of thinking in a kind of historical term, like what has already been discussed in this relation, what was a momentum that could be compared as a critical foil to the discussion today. And certainly it was this kind of, the message that was kind of attached to this image of planet Earth as sort of, an inversion again, similar perhaps in ways to what I described about the navigation systems, a kind of inversion of a gaze that was previously kind of expansionist, directed outwards towards space, towards a kind of a conquest of new worlds out there in the non-Earth bound. And then, with the kind of 68 Apollo flights and the first spectacular images, a kind of paradigm shift occurred that was, where you would find, an abundance of quotations from the astronauts themselves to all kind of commentators and high-level politicians that sort of, would announce that the actual discovery was Earth, not the moon, not space. The actual discovery is this new gaze on Earth. And somehow this absurdness of, the absurdity of this sentence, we can't put it together, it is together, really stands very well for a kind of, it almost crystallizes a kind of historical moment, an imaginary, a kind of epochal horizon, perhaps even, like a kind of, in a sense of announcing a kind of wholeness of the planetary, a kind of, post-Cartesian moment of non-detachment, of an anti-objectivist relationism. Kind of, this is very crucial, obviously, for the ecology question, for the environmental movement, to be part again with nature, to do away with this kind of alienating regime of the technocracy as the counterculture would earlier in the 60s still refer to it. But somehow this realization of this kind of relationality is actually only possible from the outside. Right? So it's a very weird, strange inversion. And a similar kind of way that, to realize that one is part of a picture when one is actually looking at it. Kind of a very interesting move. Of course, it echoes also this kind of love of Oriental, like this kind of strange Orientalism of the kind of counterculture around the Whole Earth catalog, this kind of massive import of Asian spiritualities that then were so influential in places like Esalen for the kind of whole human potential movement, where a similar kind of mantra in a way would be sort of the core of this new truth paradigm, no? In a way, healing in this kind of human potential movement idea is basically to realize that you're one and that you're connected, but you still have to realize it, right? So, like, you realize it, that, and you have always been, but you still have to kind of arrive there, no? So, in a way, very similar structure to this kind of sentence that you find here. Now, this is just to, and then I stop with the whole Earth complex, just to briefly kind of indicate where this sort of image has arrived. On the one hand, in the 80s, still the Whole Earth catalog, and then out of the Whole Earth catalog group, sometimes with very direct connections, Wired magazine, that was obviously the kind of techno-utopian Bible of the 90s, and the Whole Earth software catalog, where somehow the ideas of let's say, the more spiritually leaning ideas of realizing that new planetary unity, or psycho-spiritual ideas, have sort of already kind of segregated into the kind of domains of, on the one hand, the new age, kind of the hardcore 80s new age, and on the other hand, sort of the transference of a lot of these ideas of the commune movement, etc., into the hacker ethos. And Stuart Brand tried to recreate the Whole Earth catalog for this new culture of this upcoming emerging new digital culture. This was obviously not a success, not as the previous one, because the print medium was simply too slow. If in the software catalog they would do with software what they had done before with books of Francesco Varela or Heinz von Förster or Claude Shannon, for that matter, but the software was outdated after a few weeks often, so the print medium was not just not the right one to address this. And then the Wired magazine, which is basically 97, and exactly the year where the new economy sort of arrives at the White House, sort of becomes official politics. And what you see here is actually an image of scenario planning. It's kind of something that Stuart Brand, the editor of the Whole Earth catalog, made money with, made the business out in the 80s and until today, which is to look at possible development scenarios by the measure of how well we can tell them, and sort of invest in the capacity of narratives to be performative and to be functioning to degrees as self-fulfilling prophecies. Right? So the 25 years of a long boom that is predicted here obviously is something that probably a lot of people, particularly in the kind of digital world, believed in genuinely in 97. An optimism that is, of course, now pretty severely has its scratches. But in fact, this kind of scenario that is then in the magazine sort of laid out as a vision, kind of a Kevin Kelly-like vision of a future unity of biological, technological, social systems in a way animated by capital. Kubrick dreamt it all up. So the beautiful psychedelic last scenes of Space Odyssey anticipates, just as in the exhibition, this was also, of course, for those who know, largely Dietrich Dietrichson's passion to lay out how a lot of these ideas from early cybernetics to the 90s have been anticipated also by musicians, in song texts, in pop music. But here you have it in the cinematic imaginary. And this is a kind of film that Russell Schweickart, one of the NASA astronauts, produced based on his experience of orbiting Earth. Actually, it's meant to be a kind of early 80s peace movement film in which this is the key frame. This is sort of the hinge in the film from him narrating the experience of floating in space and realizing this stunning fragility of Earth and of life on Earth, and gradually realizing how stupid people are with all their borders and wars. And of course he says it while flying over the Middle East. And then arriving at this kind of ultimate, planetary oceanic recognition. No frames, no boundaries, sort of no frames around Earth, no boundaries on Earth. As a kind of promise, as an anticipation also, almost like the first photographs of space were in a way as well. A way almost of, the American superpower in the Cold War already kind of anticipating in this kind of photographs the end of the Cold War, because you see a non-divided world. Something that I think it's a bit simplistic to think this way, but it's important, I think, when you try to map out collective imaginaries and the kind of dream conditions that we are part of and the kind of epistemic conditions that they produce for us, that somehow there is a very strong kind of seductive power in these kind of narratives and the images that anticipate or express them, almost in a way that we would say that when the Berlin Wall came down, it was almost like the last kind of Cartesian wall of shame that stood for everything bad and divided. And now we're entering finally in this age of global connectivity, into a kind of, and then gradually that would kind of start to, this aesthetics of immersion would start to populate the kind of increasing screen environments. So sort of this is more or less becoming the face of that sort of map environmentality, like the interface, the aesthetics that pertains to the liquid crystals. This is a still of one of the last works of Harun Farocki. Somehow I'm not seeing the clock on my screen today. So would you mind signaling me time?
It's open. Time is no frames, no boundaries.
No frames, no boundaries. So Parallel is a series of 4 essay films by Harun Farocki, where he basically looks at the iconography of early computer games up to the kind of CGI digital hyperrealism of today. And for those of you who know his work, which I guess in Vienna it has been shown often, and probably some of you have also heard him speak here several times. This kind of question of of mapping and rationalization and the kind of, transition of a kind of disciplinary factory regime, its relation to the military, and then sort of the transition to the control society paradigm was something that Harun's works was a kind of permanent question in his work. So, for instance, Leben BRD, a rather early, like a mid-80s film as well, would be a film about the kind of training courses, something that appears later in many other films, where sort of, you can feel really the beginning of a new, of a kind of post-disciplinary paradigm, of discarded, traumatized bodies having to learn to be dynamic subjects and selling their image of themselves. So just as a kind of side note, this chapter of Parallel, this film on the history of computer game iconography, is a very simple exploration of how some of the most widely, globally used, distributed computer games design the edge of the world, sort of the edge of the virtual world of this game, and what happens when the player is attempting to exit the game, right? Not by game over, not by pressing the power button, but by trying to run up against the limit. And most of them, in most of these games, you're caught in this world, so you're not able to exit at all. But some of them, and this is the most visually most stunning one, actually the player falls into space, and the world itself, the game world, gradually recedes and becomes a planet. It's quite beautifully made, also. Strangely inverted, right? Because you see this here in the horizon, sort of the optics is reverted as if it's kind of through a lens rather than a planet. So the figure kind of stumbles into this nothingness and a kind of loss of orientation, a kind of groundlessness. The groundlessness is, when you see that film, is really stunning. The effect it has, at least on me personally, I could feel it in the stomach. This sudden loss of coordinates, this kind of what it means to exit that map, and this kind of hysterical, slow movements first, and then gradually starting to turn and twist almost hysterically as the world receded in the back. This is one of the juxtapositions of the very same body of work, where Harun juxtaposed a cinematographic representation of clouds with a CGI-produced game representation of the sky. This is when we see the engineer at work. Obviously, this CGI production is incredible amount of work, like to create this hyperrealism, and then to dynamize this world. And this is probably what's most interesting about this kind of film, is to see sort of how a certain history almost reproduces itself in this short history of computer games, of computer interface graphics. A history, which kind of tries to get out of a kind of mechanic paradigm to one that would be able to represent sort of the animated reality, dynamic, complex animated reality. So a long period, and Harun obviously spends long time on each motive. A long period is just a long segment is just dealing with waves, with the very, very complex algorithms that are used to produce, a surface of water and the reflections in it and the breaking of waves. When you have to immediately, it calls upon so many art historical representations, obviously. And this is a juxtaposition as if from Harun, but it's not. It's actually something that that Google recently published just, I think, 4 weeks ago, which is part of their larger research into neural networks and into the ability of images becoming mapped out, basically, in indexicalized, etc. Long time ago, I did a conference with Harun and some of the thinkers that came more from the kind of Friedrich Kittler school of thinking on the ability of of addressing images. Harun had this dream of a kind of a lexica of cinematographic topoi, and he made one film that probably comes closest to it, which is a film on the gesture of hands. And the kind of media scholars, they were interested in whether machines can address images in that way, and whether it's possible to search images with images. That was like early 2000s when the technology was just beginning to be able to realize the kind of rudimentary versions of this. And this kind of montage here appeared on the Google blog, and that's what the Google algorithm sees in this cloud of sky, in this cloudy sky. A rather stunning and slightly disgusting, I would say. Can you actually see the details of these weird animals with several heads and kind of weird Orientalism as well in there? This is just an installation shot, just a scene from the Shanghai Biennale. That I was in charge of a couple of months back, where literally every visitor that I've seen, and there are 300,000, goes through the exhibition with the smartphone. And there's something very, very normal to this, but it's still, it's like almost too obvious to even point that out or something like this. But it still made me think about kind of what is being, about the mode of reception, really, about the mode of experience. And this particular image was sort of taken in front of the work of Alexandra Domanovic, who did this little piece that just resonated with strange histories here. Now, this is actually a piece that she made against the backdrop of a Frida Kahlo painting, which is called The Dream, where she holds this yin and yang sign in the figure, between her fingers. But then this kind of robotic hand that holds the yin and yang here is the Belgrade Hand, one of the first sort of robotic or prosthesis-like hands that had a sense of touch engineered in the 1960s in former Yugoslavia. This image or this work, was part of a room that was dealing with cybernetics and with ideas, with this kind of Orientalism in cybernetics, the kind of the fringes, the visionaries of cybernetics, finding sort of their new truths being confirmed by that ancient wisdoms, and yeah. Again, notice just the green background that Alexandra chose to display her hand on. And this is a still from Hayao Miyazaki's Laputa Castle in the Sky animation. Something I borrow from Esther Leslie's discussion of liquid crystals that will be published in a few weeks in another kind of late book on an animism conference I did. Esther Leslie was working on this kind of luminosity and the role luminosity played from the Romantic age to the liquid crystal LCD screens that we use today, as a kind of effect that bears both a promise of reunification with nature, of a kind of dream of an unalienated relationship with a dialogic nature that's magic, that's affecting, that's perhaps even caring, and a kind of image of the kind of phantasmatic quality of the commodity, that kind of shine, that kind of spectrality of the commodity, and both exists in parallel in the images of this luminosity, as she traces then from Romanticism, which of this image here is particularly borrowing from that tradition because it's coming from mining and the magic of the deep inside of the mountains, obviously, and Romanticism is very closely tied to each other in a very strange connection of something very anthropocenic to an aesthetic phenomena and a way of thinking. And she traces it from Romanticism via, Benjamin's description of the arcades, where the commodities in the shop windows are kind of emitting the same kind of luminescent shine on the dreaming collective of 19th century capitalist Paris. And this is a work that I think is dealt most beautifully with this aesthetics, with these questions in recent years by the Autolus group called Anathema, a kind of non-narrative work where most of their films are somehow, have a very strong essayistic narrative dimension. This one is a sort of psychedelic journey into the inside of that the kind of engines that have become in micro scale part of our everyday environments, and what they tried to do was somehow indulge perhaps, and invoke in this fantasy of what it is like when the interior of the digital machines, sort of from the chip, the silicon, the liquid crystals, what it would be like if they dreamt us up, rather than looking at the kind of desire that was the first picture, right? The desire to touch that luminescent crystal in Miyazaki's film. This work, Anathema, tries to sort of imagine the opposite, the desire inside that machines, the kind of way in which they dream us up. So, the opposite of that kind of, just the complementary side of this kind of desire of touch that made, obviously, our touch screens so sexy. It has a kind of incredible kind of Kubrick-like feeling, this journey through this pixelated world, this pixelated space. Now I'm back with Harun Farocki. This is a montage that I made myself with a still from of Harun's work here on the upper left, and an image that he took from the internet for a proposal for a film that he wanted to do, which was a kind of direct continuation, if you will, or a deepening of this research that he started with the Parallele. But he wanted to go back to Marais, to Muybridge, and to kind of the early days of rationalizing factory work, of dissecting movement and recomposing it. This kind of the beginnings of cinema, really. He wanted to go back to it and think. On the one hand, I think pretty much through the very obvious and almost very non-spectacular similarity of seeing some of Marais' test subjects at work and the CGI environments today in which films like Avatar are made, as you see here. There is an obvious analogy, right? Because many of the kind of the abstract movement studies of Marais, exactly those studies that would then become part of the science of work, of organizing, the factory line and rationalizing movement from early Ford production to the army. He wanted to go back to it, I think, because this similarity, there is something that this kind of analogy between this early movement studies where actors wear suits with, black suits with white dots on them, which then becomes that which can be traced on the photograph, on the chronophotograph, and this suits that actors wear today with exactly also these points that can become the coordinates for CGI engineers. In order to understand the massive transformation that has happened in between and that is obscured by the analogy itself. And I think that has to do perhaps with the image on the upper left and with something that I slightly historically incorrect started to refer to as the winter of artificial intelligence. The winter of artificial intelligence is a term that people working in AI use, but they use it in a very particular way, namely as signifying the moment when massive government spending and corporate funding for artificial intelligence research was frozen for a long time, actually, because artificial intelligence did not really live up to the expectations, right? And without going into detail, I will just try to explain with an analogy that I actually borrow from Harun. When he spoke about the difficulty that was one of the things that was surprising and stunning him most when looking at digital animation and also robotics, was that it was somehow so incredibly difficult to simulate and recreate human walking. It always looks mechanic. Yeah? There's always, somehow it falls behind the kind of uncanny valley. It's just never looking quite organic and real. No? So you can immediately just kind of recognize what's human and what's not, sort of as if, the kind of stigma and stain of kind of mechanic objectivism and disciplinary rationality would just not want to leave this kind of new cyborg creatures, right? Something that just didn't want to come quite alive. No? And obviously everybody knows this what I'm talking about. No? This kind of walking, this problem of walking, and he has never directly addressed this in his films, but he did address a a lot the question of hands, as I already said. So it kind of, when do you actually still need a human being in a factory line? When there's a certain, chaos, a certain entropy, when things are not lying, when they just kind of are thrown by the machine into a basket, then you would need a human to sort them out back, like to kind of recognize how they lie there, etc. Things that obviously today can be done with algorithms rather easily for many, many purposes. So this image here is this kind of, it's part of that attempt to overcome, in a way, that problem, that problem that is, I think, so nicely described with the winter of artificial intelligence. And then I'm just trying to understand how did that problem get solved, right? And I think that the answer is already exactly in this image of Avatar, of the making of Avatar. Because you no longer try to kind of reproduce, let's say, for the sake of making it short, life and its complexities, let's say, inside a cybernetic brain that you give the shape that's anthropomorphic or non-anthropomorphic. You rather create an environment in which that part of life's complexities and what remains of an organic aesthetics complements and inscribes itself and formats itself according to the machine. So this is the entire, it's like a similar shift as with the navigation system again, or perhaps also with the image of the photograph of the planet. So that basically is, let me just go back to, no, I think that's probably enough, no? I guess I've probably done my 40 minutes, more than enough, so thank you.